This is a bit of a pitch for some work that I think we should do as a community. This is about creating a derivative definition framework. Given other talks and materials that have been passed around in the past, you might have heard the terms IPTs. That's what this is. All right, so let's get into it. The shift to modern Drupal has been pretty great, but maybe we have lost something as we've made that shift. Not sure that all of our needs are being met with the current architecture in the system. One of the things Drupal hasn't really addressed in its framework very robustly is files and any derivatives of those. But it's super important to our use cases. Legacy Islandora had this in spades with the content model definitions, and we relied on that very heavily for a lot of features that were in Legacy Islandora. We can build something in modern Drupal that is essentially similar, but with the power of Drupal and all of its plugin systems, we can make it much more reliable and powerful than what we had in Legacy Islandora. So this isn't just a theoretical problem. As a community right now, we are having an issue with interoperability and generalizing and sharing our work. When it comes to data modeling, we found that one size does not fit all. Various sites and vendors have been creating rather specific implementations of things rather than universal ones around. And there's differences that are, they're very legitimate different use cases from time to time. But there's no canonical way to figure out what those are. So, for instance, CGI is also working on a IIIF implementation at the moment, and we're having difficulty supporting both the multi-file design and the more standard broken out media and files. So this would also help us with reporting. Right now, it's hard to determine when a object or a node has all of the media and files to it that you're hoping to in your design. If there was a single place to query to figure out what that design is, we'd be able to share all of that functionality instead of recreating it in the various sites that we're currently creating. Also in tooling, DJI is currently writing and using commands to determine what derivatives are missing and generate them from that. It's a pretty common use case, even in high availability that we have today. Folks often have well, not often, I won't say that, have service interruptions and need to do some repairs. Derivatives can run for a very long time, and a small interruption can have an impact. So what we've created will fit our needs, but I am concerned that it might not fit everyone's needs, and I'd like that work to be shareable and usable by everyone. So what could a derivative definition framework look like? Well, in modern Drupal, content types are how Drupal does data modeling. One way we could build on that is having an entity associated with the content types that defines the derivations. And from that, we could base a plugin system that allowed us to define derivative definitions separate from their implementations, because there's another point that there's often varying needs and requirements. Some people might want a JP2 or a JPEG service file, depending on what exactly they're serving. Also, plugins for views integration, so that we can abstract away some of the underlying complexity for the administrators. And plugins for search, largely for performance reasons that maybe we won't get into today. But that's just one implementation, and I have been hearing some chatter around the schema.org project and how that might also be leveraged to at least start on an implementation of something like this. So what's in it for all of us? Greater configurability, the ability to change out those implementations for derivatives, as we were talking about earlier. This could be a thing that your administrators are doing instead of currently largely developers. The ability to compose derivative schemes. This could also be an administrative action rather than a developer one. And you could be using these actions and plugins from lots of different projects. If we were sharing a framework without the need to implement your own. Greater interoperability. I've mentioned a couple of times already the desire to share the work we're doing at DGI. We'd also love to leverage the work that others have been doing. And introspection. Once we know what is expected of our objects and we can determine what state they're in, we can decide what to do about it, to normalize or not to normalize, and who to alert to the states that we find that are unexpected. And we could build general tools there that would work for everybody instead of site or vendor specific tools. So I've been talking in pretty high level terms here, and I'd like to keep it that way for the purpose of this talk, because the technicals are, let's say, very deep, and we could probably argue about implementation for days. And I think that that's a conversation that should happen should we go through this with this kind of work. So previously we had proposed one kind of implementation and a roadmap for that, including upgrade paths. And those documents are with the IF, but it's not the only possible implementation. And I encourage, if we do go forward with something like this, that we have very open conversations about what would best serve everyone. And that's the pitch. But I'd love to talk about it now. If anyone has any thoughts or questions. Okay.
Would this be like one of the things that we're kind of running into now is like, how do we know that all the derivatives work? Is this like, helping to generate like a good way to, a framework for reports on incomplete objects? Is there the concept of like this is a complete object that constitutes these media and these fields on these media and the fields are valid?
Absolutely. That is one of the primary use cases. So we'd be defining, much like the old content models, what the expected service files are, and we'd be able to create reports and views about that, and well, any other programmatic ones we would so need. Mark? Well, paragraphs that was just our first possible implementation, but it would just be an implementation detail. Those paragraphs could be used as the entity that contains that mapping that would be part of, attached to the content types. So we'd be using paragraph types as if they were an extension of the content types.
I know you said you didn't want to get into the technical side, but just so I understand more, could paragraphs add a little bit of complexity to a site? I'm not saying it's not worth it, I'm just pointing that out. What other kinds of implementations could there be that would add few dependencies as possible?
Well, when we were looking at it, paragraphs in the balance came out ahead, to be honest, but there are other implementations. You might conceive of a way to use an additional content type itself and link those content type to content type. It gets really kind of nifty where you get in the code space, though, almost to the point where you might be re-implementing lots of paragraphs once you consider things like derivatives being derived from other derivatives, and daisy chaining there and other such things. But yeah, at its core, you just need some sort of entity that you can have many of and configure with arbitrary fields, and be able to incorporate that in the content type. And paragraphs, that is essentially a definition of paragraphs. Yeah. So that's why we started there. But we could definitely look at other things. I would say that for the most part, we found ways around in our own sites the performance implications of using paragraphs. And there's just a host of best practices that we could share around that. The plugins that I mentioned would also be pretty key for that. Once we, especially Vue's plugins around this, can be made very intelligent and skip around a lot of entity loading. So yeah, there'd be a fair bit of upfront work could limit the performance implications, which and when it comes to user level complexity, we can build any arbitrary UI around the entities we have under the hood. We can make it as friendly as possible. You know, content modeling, and then at the end of the day, will remain a relatively complex action, but we can make it sensible. Yes, sir.
Okay, let me just go down this rabbit hole. We have avoided paragraphs to the degree possible, and which doesn't mean we don't use them, but we avoid them because of the complexity of the data structures and what they do to the database. And I think that with the changes in Drupal 10 to the field structure, I think it might be easier and, to my mind, a cleaner approach to use field structures rather than paragraphs. But it's my opinion.
All right. For the mic, was proposed field structures rather than paragraphs, and awesome. I'm not sure how that would look, but it sounds good.
They are reusable in a way that they weren't previously. So it would work essentially the same way. It would just eliminate one element. But you wind up with the same thing, essentially. You could use that field structure as you use paragraphs, but it would be cleaner from a database point of view at least.
Awesome. That sounds pretty promising. Donald?
Where do you imagine
I'm sorry?
Where do you imagine the derivative generation taking place? Is it on another server, the existing server?
So the question is, where would I imagine the derivative generation taking place? And honestly, there would be no change, just as is now. But to something Alexander was mentioning earlier, I think it would also be a great idea for us to have alternative ways of deriving things. We could create a plugin system for that alongside this work, and allow for local derivation, which would suit another class of users. But you know, with a plugin system, we get both. Rosie?
I'm going to start with a bit of a comment, sorry. Back in Islandora 7, when we had content models, each of them could define like what data themes they had, and they could give them whatever names they wanted. But despite that, we did kind of have a bit of a, like everyone did things the same way. TN always meant the thumbnail, and OBJ always meant downloadable file. With what we've got right now in modern Islandora, are those media use terms, where we really gone to the other direction of making sure that anytime you see something that's a service file, you know what it's supposed to be for. Same thing for thumbnails and whatever. So does your method include these kind of globalized ways of referring to specific media? Or would your implementation have to take, like, do something else in order to provide, you know, the thumbnail version of this object, or the downloadable file for this object, or those generic things that you kind of want everything to be able to give us, regardless of its content model?
Those relations are super useful, and I'd keep them in place. I think we might have more of them.
I should point out that DJI does use paragraphs pretty extensively now. I think the biggest challenge we run into is how to represent it on a CSV, and you're trying to do a large JS, and sometimes it's a little challenging representing it on a CSV, what the limiters you're going to use, things of that nature. But I mean, outside of that, I don't think we've had any significant issues with paragraphs.
So Luke brought up one of my favorite tangents there, just for the mic. The problem of hierarchical data in flat CSVs. And if anyone can find me a format that's not XML that will solve the problem and be accepted by archivists and librarians.
Yeah.
If you're replacing XML with JSON, now you have two problems. So now you have one to date.
Yeah. But let's not create a new format either.
That is exactly the hard part of the workbench, is figuring out if people want more complex data.
But yeah, you know, the CSV.
It's still CSV, and again, it's very strange. Seth and I came across a very strange use case with paragraphs, where paragraph, you can have multiple instances, like repeated instances of the entire paragraph field with all of its subfields. But if you want to have one of the subfields to be repeatable, and that gets into like a third level of subdivision, which within the CSV field, and we kind of said, not now. Maybe later, if something really wonky, we can figure it out, but just to get this thing out the door, not now.
There's only so many delimiters you can use in a single cell.
Here it comes, Jason. Here it comes, Jason.
The challenge.
Mark's going to invent pivot tables in CSV.
I remember talking to Adam about it, and he's like, what do you want me to use at this point?
Functional, I think maybe.
North American keyboard only has so many things you can use that don't exist in free text.
I guess this is everyone else's favorite conundrum too. Any more thoughts or questions on this presentation, folks? Rosie?
What do you want to see happen?
Well, Rosie asked what I want to see happen. Well, I'd love to see the leadership groups of the IF and various organizations and our members to come together and put resources towards an initiative that accomplishes this. That'd be my ideal. It's a lot for one committer or even a couple of committers to take on, and it has it would require migration work, and that gets pretty complex. And we want to provide a fair bit of support to the organizations. I don't want to, while I can think this work is completely doable, I don't want to understand the understate, the level of effort that would be required. And I think it definitely needs to have a broad-based consensus and understanding of the implications.
I think it was funny, because I remember talking, like, don't use the word migration, because I don't want to view that as some kind of big, massive migration. It's like changing the structure of the data type. Like, I encountered it not too long.
Luke, maybe you'd like to come up and speak into the mic with your nuance there.
Oh, sure.
That was a bit much for me to repeat, I think.
I just want to point out before we all started this, I'm like, don't use the word migration because it might scare people, but it's not like a crazy migration, like going from like 7 to 2.0. It's just changing the structure of the data that's already there. So like I encountered something recently, a small example of this would be like file hash did a big update and it actually moved the data from the separate table into the file manage table. So it's just an example of that it'd be something built into the upgrade process. So it's not like some like big thing that people have to spend a ton of money on. It's like it'd be just changing the structure of the data that's already in the database.
Internal data.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah,
Yeah.
So it's not like a migration is in like from 7 to 2.0. Like it's not. So yeah, that's why I was like, don't use the word migration. Use something else because it's.
Okay, well, couldn't that just be an UpDB script?
Yes, so UpDB is how you do these in modern Drupal.
Yeah.
Yeah. This would be a particularly large one, though, for some of the larger institutions, and a standalone script might be more appropriate, given the runtimes involved. Or just a whole lot of warning when it was going to land.
Yeah. I don't know, it's just great to have that consistency of a process.
It really is good to have that consistency. Anyone else like to add anything?
Would this be useful to, like, there's a lot of people who do pretty serious and write about, like, content architecture and content modeling, and in the wider Drupal world, not just in Islandora. Do you think this could be useful to, you know, people like, you know, Jeff Eaton and those guys who really know their stuff in terms of content modeling?
Yeah, so Alexander was asking if this work would have broader appeal to any of the Drupal community, and I got to say yes, and not just to specific folks that are very interested in data modeling in that community. I actually worked on a pure Drupal commerce site with some rather complex needs with file management that if this had existed then, I would have pushed to use very strongly. It's definitely not the entirety of the Drupal community that has complex file management needs, but they're home spinning their solutions, and this would definitely reduce the workload for a few projects. If we put it on Drupal.org.
Yeah.
Anyone else? Okay. Well, I think it might be lunchtime, so enjoy.